the largest empire in Western Africa, or there were four concentric empires rather. The Empire of Ghana, which was today would be in the country Mauritania, but is where the country Ghana takes its name. Then Mali, which the Empire of Mali at its height spread all the way from Senegal deep into Mauritania, 1,500 miles across, probably the most wealthy empire in African history other than ancient Egypt. And according to even mainstream scholars like Felipe Fernandez Armesto, the richest state in the 14th century world. This is one mosque / university from that empire. This particular one is the Grand Mosque of Djinguereber. Has anyone ever heard of a place called Timbuktu? Now, did anyone else think Timbuktu was a made-up place when they first heard of Timbuktu? I know when I was young, I thought Timbuktu was a made-up place. Turns out Timbuktu was a real place, and there's a university still standing in Timbuktu in the ancient Malian Empire, but there's good reason why we think of Timbuktu as being magical, as we're going to come to a little bit later. In the Malian kingdom, there are still 750,000 handwritten manuscripts surviving. 750,000 to this day, containing all kinds of information. Now, one of them was brought to the attention of the world by Michael Palin in a BBC program called Sahara. And he basically says, I'll paraphrase here, but he says this document, which is from the kingdom of Mali at the time, clearly shows the phases of the moon. The problem with it is that it's 150 to 200 years older than the birth of Galileo and Copernicus. So it makes us think about the entire history of science in an interesting way. Again, that's not me saying that, that's Michael Palin saying that. If you've got beef, take it up with Michael Palin.
What you are hearing right now is not myth. This is documented African history. Timbuktu was not just a city, it was one of the greatest centers of learning in the world. For centuries, Europeans portrayed Africa as a continent without science, without universities, without written knowledge. Yet here we see hundreds of thousands of manuscripts proving the opposite. Today, we are going to revisit Mali, Timbuktu, and Africa's hidden global influence, the history they rarely teach in schools.
And that Christopher Columbus was the first of these. Christopher Columbus actually wrote in the journal of the second voyage that when he was in Haiti, Native Americans came to them and told them that black-skinned people had come in large boats trading in gold-tipped metal spears. Columbus took 2 of these spears and sent them back to Spain to be assayed. They were microscopically inspected in Spain. Then they found that of 32 parts, 18 were gold, 6 of silver, 8 of copper. That's identical with spears being forged in African Guinea. And all the songs that the Native Americans were using for these spears are the same songs that the Africans were using, Ghana and Kane and Kani and Ghanin, etc. The Americans had added one word, Ghanini, the gold merchants, which referred to the Africans bringing in these things. And then I found Ferdinand Columbus wrote a book in his father. He said, my father told me he saw Negroes north of Honduras. And then I found that Vasco Nunez de Balboa on September 25th in the year 1513, coming down the slopes of Caracua, which is in Darien, which we now call Panama, actually saw 2 tall black men among the Native Americans. The Spanish were startled. These men were about 1.5 feet taller than the Native American. They were exceedingly black. They had a different texture of hair, different features, and they asked the Native Americans where these black men come from, and they said, we don't know, but they're in a large settlement nearby, and we're waging war with them, and we've captured these 2. Several people commented that. Peter Martyr, one of the first historians of America, said that these black people must have been shipwrecked long ago from Africa and had taken refuge in these mountains. Now,
this challenges the entire narrative we were taught. Africa was not primitive. It was technologically advanced. Colonization did not build Africa. It dismantled Africa.
Himself was aware that African mariners had preceded him. In his diary of his second voyage, Columbus tells of how the natives of Hispaniola actually had given him gold-tipped metal spearheads that they said were brought by black-skinned people who had come in large boats from the south and southeast. Coincidence? I think not. No. So what's interesting about that, so upon returning to Spain, is that he actually took the spearheads and he sent them away and they had them assayed, and it turned out to be that these spearheads were covered in this metal, this alloy that the inhabitants called guanin, and The metallurgists actually found out that this was an alloy of 32 parts. It was like 18 of gold, 6 of silver, 8 of copper, which, dun dun dun, matched the metal used in spearheads made in Western Africa for thousands of years, as carried by medieval African warriors, including the Mali and the Moors. The West Africans even called this metal guanine, the same name used by the natives of Hispaniola. But nothing more was said about that.
This is not conspiracy. This is historical evidence. Africans were global travelers, traders, and explorers long before European empires.
Next slide, please. This is a European map from 1413 AD. The two gentlemen in the map, the gentleman on the left is Mansa Musa, king of the Malian Empire at its height. He is estimated by many economists today to have been the richest human that ever lived. They estimate he might have been worth as much as 400 billion in today's money. And I'm not saying that that's necessarily a massive achievement for Africa, because one person being rich and being a king sort of probably implies some form of oppression, usually. But as far as kings go, Mansa Musa was said to have been a fairly decent king who gave away a lot of money, gold, to poor people, particularly on his pilgrimage to Mecca. He gave away so much gold in Egypt that it took 10 years for the price of gold to return to normal. That's how much gold he gave away in Egypt. And part of the mythology about Timbuktu and about this wealthy black kingdom was a result of Mansa Musa's pilgrimage to Mecca and all of the rumors that spread around the world, and particularly around Europe at the time, that was going through the plague and the Dark Ages and all kind of other madness, while Mali was fairly rich. They heard about this African king down there past where the Moroccans live. We need to go and find that guy because he's getting some money. Now, the gentleman on the right was the ruler of the Moors. Why have I picked this particular image? Because the way that history has been racialized, even in the modern world, for those who don't know, by the way, Spain was a Muslim country for 800 years. So African and Arab Muslims colonized Spain in 711 AD until 1492, the year Columbus set sail. For 800 years, Spain was a Muslim country. No one thinks to teach us that in school. But because there was forms of race-based slavery in the Islamic world, some of the scholars have deliberately kind of distorted the history and said the only role of black people in the Islamic world, full stop, and even in Moorish Spain, was as servants and slaves, and that same history has come into play in that world, even though we know, because we have copious pictures, hundreds of pictures. I've just shown you Saint Maurice, which also means more, of rulers, of people in every position, clearly depicted as black. One only has to read Shakespeare as a fellow, and it becomes very clear that who Shakespeare had in mind when he was describing Moorish people. We know that there were 4 main dynasties in Spain, and that two of the major dynasties, the Almoravid and the Almohad, were what we call Berbers. If you go to Africa today, you'll see that there are Berbers that are all kinds of mixes. The Tuareg people, for example, some of the blackest people in Africa are Berbers, as are much of the population of Morocco. So even that history has been deliberately distorted to paint away some of the role of black African people in the Islamic world. But let's see what was actually going on in Europe. It's a gentleman called Saint Maurice. Saint Maurice was part of the Theban Egyptian legions of the Roman army. He became a saint in Christendom. These are carvings of Saint Maurice, or paintings of Saint Maurice rather, from 16th century Germany.
Europe knew Africa was powerful. They mapped our kings. They traded with our empires. They feared our wealth. Yet today, they tell the world Africa was backward. That is not history. That is propaganda. Timbuktu, Mali, and the great empires of West Africa were not just African history. They were world history. If Africa had such knowledge, wealth, and global influence centuries ago, imagine what Africa can do today when we reclaim our identity. This is why Voice of Africa exists, to tell African history with dignity, truth, and pride.